All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started for the sake of our lunch hour and time, since we have a pretty packed program. I'm Jasmine Wahi. I'm the Holly Block Social Justice Curator here at the Bronx Museum, or the Bronx Museum in cyberspace. And I am thrilled to kick off our first program for Shaun Leonardo's exhibition, The Breath of Empty Space. We'll be doing an exhibition walkthrough, which we have pre-recorded with Shaun and the curator of the exhibition, John. And by way of starting, I'm going to just read their brief bios. But before I do that, I just want to let all of you know that following the exhibition walkthrough, we're going to have a Q&A session. And so as you're watching the walkthrough, you can share your questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat. And at the end, I will be passing your questions along. Just so you're aware, if there are questions that are very similar in nature, I will be kind of recompiling them so we get as many answers to all of your burning questions as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our artist and curator. Shaun Leonardo's multidisciplinary work negotiates social expectations of manhood, namely definitions surrounding Black and Brown masculinities, along with its notions of achievement, collective identity, and experience of failure. His performance practice, anchored by his work in Assembly, a diversion program for court-involved youth at the Brooklyn-based arts nonprofit Recess, where he is now the co-director, is participatory and invested in a process of embodiment. Leonardo is a Brooklyn-based artist from Queens, New York City. He received his MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. He is a recipient of support from Creative Capital, Guggenheim Social Practice, Art for Justice, and a Blade of Grass Foundation. He was recently profiled in the New York Times and CNN. His work has been featured at the Guggenheim Museum, the High Line, and the New Museum, with his current solo exhibition, The Breath of Empty Space, recently presented at MICA and Mass MoCA, is now at the Bronx Museum. Starting in 2021, Leonardo joined Recess as co-director, helping guide the organization's continuous evolution as an engine of social change. About John. John Chaich is an independent curator and designer interested in otherness, materiality, and communication. He's curated a range of group and solo exhibitions, including Mixed Messages, AIDS, Art, and Words, produced for visual aids at La Mama Galleria in New York, and Transformer in Washington, D.C. Queer Threads, Crafting Identity and Community at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York, and the Maryland Institute of Art in Baltimore. Amongst many, many other shows. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip ahead. Recently, John served as a curatorial consultant for the exhibition. TJ Dew Norris presents The Estate of Tamika Janine Norris at the Fig Museum in Iowa, and curated Andre Taylor Jackson, Crowns, and Zoe Sagler Darn at Transformer and at the Corner at Whitman Walker in DC, as well as related artist lectures in collaboration with GWU's museum, the Textile Museum, and the American University Museum. And without further ado, I'm going to attempt what we've practiced multiple times, which is getting this video started.
Walter Scott remembered. Walter. You can learn grace when you see the picture of a slain man and still see him smiling, breathing, being alive. The quell, the copper anguish when you convince yourself to not burn down the house that engulfed him. Scott. There are so many we have lost to the violent nature of this country that is bent on killing the thing it believes cannot easily die. The spirit of a man, whether running or in a hoodie, whether laughing or loitering, is not target practice. A spirit of a human, whether here or not here, is still here. Ask my mama. She does not argue with ghosts who have been taken from the salt of the salt too soon. Too soon. She has taught me to speak of the fast fallen in reverence in case their energy is near. In case they forget the way they died is a way to die. Too many dust to dust. Not enough ash upon birth. Ain't no rise like the heat of a people who have buried too many, and so many too soon. Death comes for us all, no matter if our mouths are full of gold or rot, no matter if we utter Psalm 23, no matter if we say we matter, our Black lives matter. In a country fortified on our great-grandparents' backs is only a fact of the map. No matter, it seems death comes as if we called it home for dinner. It seems death arrives whether or not we've prepared our bodies for it to feast. Remembered. We are all complicit. We are all witnesses. We bear the burden of bringing the responsible forward. We bear the burden of our sisters, brothers of our neighbors and elders, our youth and saplings. We cannot fight the power when we sleep beside the brazen burn. We cannot fight for justice when we nod and nod in silence, always. Silence not protected in this silence. Still feel safe here? Beneath the undercurrent of a country that asks for our allegiance, the war is on the other side of the door. There is no easy way to say this. It is up to us. It is our task. We must do the heavy lifting. We must boycott and breach the teachings, paralyzed our critical thinking.
Hello, I'm Chaich. I'm an independent curator based here in New York, and I've had the honor of working with the artist Shaun Leonardo for the past 3 or 4 years to organize the exhibition Shaun Leonardo, The Breath of Empty Space. This is a poignant, powerful series of drawings that Shaun has worked on for a course of 4 to 6 years. The first time this body of work has been shown together, and the content spans 4 decades, looking at and asking us to look differently at the visual narrative perpetuated by the media and our memories around the experiences, how we experience and empathize around systematic violence against Black and brown bodies in contemporary American history. The show is a call for empathetic witness or active seeing, asking viewers to slow down, be present with the work, be aware of what knowledge and memory we're bringing to seeing each piece, as much as each piece is looking back at us. And tonight, we'll have the opportunity to talk through a series of the pieces that all have a unique connection to the New York region, where Shaun was both born and now lives and works in Brooklyn. Hi, Shaun.
You know, this series of drawings we started, which began in 2014, I will admit, really started as a process for myself, in which it was important to me to give myself the time and space and quiet to process these images of death, of trauma, but on different terms. And that's what drawing allowed, a sort of process in which I could grapple with the image slowly, differently, quite literally carving out the image before my eyes. And so in turn, I'm hoping that these drawings provide space for us to contemplate these images differently, outside of the distraction of media noise. And so what's important to note is that my process is additive. I make decisions along the way. And so with each move, I'm hoping to guide your looking toward information that would otherwise go overlooked, or which we would selectively choose not to see, so that we gain information that was not in our purview at first, or that maybe we somehow, whether consciously or not, attempted to bury. And so I invite you in this work to sit with the hurt and to allow yourself to think about the ways these images exist in our bodies, and then dictate how we see and move in the world.
Shaun, we're here with your Central Park 5 series in the Breath of Empty Space exhibition. The series you drew in 2017. This is a renowned story and case from the late 80s. What drew you to this content, and how did you make the decisions to reframe the story we see across these 5 pieces, using these techniques of removing information and additionally highlighting information using a mix of lights and traditional charcoal? And how did you frame each scene, or to get us to see things that are there or not there?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, John. And so, just to give you a bit of background context, I think I was moved to explore the Central Park 5 case as part of this series because so much of what I was investigating before this drawing in terms of contemporary examples of police violence and systemic oppression of Black and brown human beings led me to start digging into my own personal experience with the media and these moments of tragedy that directly impacted my own self-perception, this being the very first in which I can recall vividly the language and imagery used to criminalize these 5 young boys, and without being able to articulate it in language, understanding that process could be very easily directed at me.
You knew it was as much a trial by media as it was in the support system.
Absolutely. And so in that examination and understanding how this particular event was internalized by me during my childhood, I set to research the images around this case. And unsurprisingly, what you find are mugshots. And so, as part of the impetus behind this series is to question what images survive in our collective consciousness, and there being no accident that while they are now the exonerated 5, that in the media and in the ways the narrative persists, the mugshot still prevails. And so I wanted to dig a little further and discovered this widely used image of the court scene. And what shocked me at first, which required a little bit of more investigation, was that the image that is first presented to you is a sharply cropped image somewhere in the middle of this scene, in which you're presented with 5 boys in a row. And if you are not attuned enough to really examining the faces and understanding the context and lineage of the trial, then you would not have realized that those 5 boys were not the Central Park 5. That it was a neatly cropped image because it carried the narrative well. But instead, the boys on trial were spread out throughout that court. And so what I decided to do, therefore, is allow that to play out for the viewer. And so in many of the drawings in this exhibition, what I do as a strategy is take a single image and separate the information horizontally. And so what you're seeing before you is one single image that would be collapsed if all this information were to be joined together. But in this slow rendering and therefore observation, you're more keen to observe the ways in which these dynamics played out between all the different individuals in that scene. And so each one of these drawings highlights one particular boy of the Central Park Five as they sit in that court scene. And then later, what I try to trace for the viewer are the various participants. Because how much time do we spend actually fixing our attention on anyone other than those criminalized boys? And it's in paying attention, it's in the slowness of that reading that you understand and see and internalize the ways that all of these individuals that have a stake in this scene, how so few of them, if any of them, actually were paying any attention to those boys. And so it's only with the division of information do you see that all of these eyes are darting in different directions. And that there's a smallness, there's a way that these boys were rendered invisible in that scene. And then, of course, then we have to question how that plays out in real time, in the ways that they are treated and unseen in that procedure.
And the participation or attention of the different players in this scene also reflects the participation and attention you're asking of us as viewers across these 5 pieces.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, John.
Shaun, we're here with your Eric Garner series, created in 2017, reframing a story that perhaps most of us are very familiar with through Eric's words, "I Can't Breathe," that inspired the title of this exhibition, and unfortunately we've heard echoed through the words of George Floyd and beyond. This is a very powerful, painful, poetic series of works that we're looking at now. What was it like for you to create this and return to your own memory and relationship to Eric's story?
Yeah. Thank you, John. You know, as a starting point, what I would like to offer is that unique quality of drawing that invites both the beauty and anguish in its process, which was very much the point of rendering not only this series of drawings, but the entire exhibition. When I first attempted to internalize the footage of Eric Garner's murder, like many people, I found it near impossible. But then I found myself, unlike other individuals, returning to it, watching it over and over and over again. And so the question emerged for me, which then later became the impetus and or driving principle of this work. The question being not if and when we choose to see, but how. And I took a moment and I paused and I realized that I was looking at this footage through my experience as a fighter and as an experience of someone that knows how to enact self-defense in search, yes, in search of some possible way, some opening for Eric Garner to have saved his own life. That, of course, being impossible.
You were compelled to try to find that space where he could have acted.
And so instead, I tried to find a different metaphorical space.
Yeah.
And I gave myself, as a process, really tight parameters for engaging the trauma, but also the specificity of this scene. And so you will see that in many of the drawings, what I typically do is choose a scene that is both widely disseminated, but it is also the still prior to the person's death.
Yes.
Because it's in that space, or it's my hope that in that space we can actually gather more meaning. That there is actually more information to be offered where we don't immediately shut down and desensitize. And so I gave myself the parameters of spending 6 to 8 to 10 hours with the same image over the course of a week. And within those parameters, in the attempt of completing a drawing, what I was forced to do is gravitate toward very particular sets of information. And so what emerged for me, therefore, was not only the anguish and really existing and living with his expression, but also the possibility of just really sincerely looking at what that maneuver entailed. Or the possibility of seeing that scene as nothing more than a tree-lined street that Eric Garner was familiar with. Or redacting the information in ways that we just have to sit in particular areas of that space, understanding what became an arena of violence, but what on any other day could have been just Eric Garner standing there. Well, the Attica tragedy, like so many other incidents and deaths and murders that are captured in these drawings, those events are revealed in fuller picture as the years go on. This being a perfect example in which it was once believed that everyone who died in this ambush, in what resulted in a massacre, that so many of the lives that were taken were actually the responsibility of the prisoners, namely those of the corrections officers and other workers in that space. And it's later, nearly 3 decades later, been revealed that so much of it was the negligence of the barrage by law enforcement as ordered by the governor. And so, as it plays out in so many of these other drawings, what I'm questioning is, how is it that we remember? This being one of those images that left a deep impression on me. And as you said, this possibility of it being a courageous, pivotal scene of positivity, of possibility, and yet just behind this scene is a massacre in the waiting. And so with drawing, and I always like to pay or give some attention to the technical aspects of the work, when I first started drawing this work, I had no intention or understanding that it would later be covered by a two-way mirrored tint. Instead, I took on the painstaking task of really just locating myself in each one of those raised fists and capturing this scene almost in its ghostly quality to convey that impermeability of memory and the ways that even an image that is so striking can be elusive. And so in a lot of the drawings, whether they're rendered in pencil or in charcoal, I vary the line weight, I vary the density of the charcoal to give you some literal and metaphorical breadth in the imagery. It gives you a depth for you to exist in the work. And then I found myself gravitating and paying all my attention to these four central figures and taking all of the time to render those in as realistic and accurate of a form. And then understanding in this impossibility of memory, in this possibility of collectively understanding what this scene entailed, and also never, ever possibly knowing who these people were, that I had to somewhat obliterate this scene to force ourselves to look at ourselves in the image of these faces, to implicate us in our looking, in our remembering. And it also questioned how it is that we sit not only with, but in this type of image. Do we see ourselves as one of the masses? Or do we see ourselves outside of this scene as something that is distant and foreign? These prisoners initiating this uprising for basic human needs and values. And yet somehow, in the ways that we remember, in the ways that history collects the information, they are still seen as less than. And they are still rendered invisible in the narrative of their own lives.
Shaun, we're here with one of several portraits in the exhibition, The Breath of Empty Space. This piece examining the story and asking us to think again and feel more around the story of Shaun Bell from Queens, like you.
Yeah.
This piece is dated from 2014 to 17. You particularly sat with this one, worked with this one person for some time. Tell us about that process and kind of extended relationship for you.
Yeah, there's a misnomer in that it's sort of understood that these works are a direct response to the tragedies and murders at the hands of the police as they happen. And that's actually not my process. The first three of this series were the Trayvon Martin portraits, Shaun Bell, and a lesser known tragedy of Jonathan Ferrell. This being the second, in which when sitting with the image with Trayvon, as I said and I mentioned earlier, really for myself, what was brought up, what was invoked in me, similarly to the Central Park 5 incident, was the killing of Shaun Bell, which for me was, in my upbringing, in my young adult life, that first time that I saw myself in the image of a victim. Again, this being known all around Queens, the protests being very active in my neighborhood, and just knowing deeply, without the verbal knowledge, but instead the embodied knowledge, that this could happen to any of the people that I was surrounded by, and certainly with any mistake, with any left turn, that this could very well be the outcome of so many of our lives. And so, as you said, I sat with it for years and years and years. And then, as was important to me, I wanted others to look deeply into Shaun Bell's eyes, as I felt the need to do. And so this became the first attempt at utilizing the mirrored film, a two-way mirror which allows you to still see through that filter and take in the quality of charcoal and that painstaking process of rendering an image through drawing while still seeing yourself in the image simultaneously. Again, the question emerging or being raised to the surface of how is it that we identify with these victims? Do we take any of the time to see in ourselves in an image that was his wedding photo?
That was circulated like a mugshot.
Absolutely. And then again, the question of why this image? And this slippage, this way in which there becomes a selection process of justifying his humanity. The narrative always being contingent on it, oh, he died during his bachelor party. As if for some reason that saves him, that restores his sense of humanity. When the full picture, when the full narrative should be, this happens to people like Shaun Bell all the time. And so again, questioning what survives in our collective consciousness, what survives in our collective consciousness, and how, without that time and space to continue to look, to continue to say his name, to remember that Shaun Bell and everyone else depicted in this work becomes buried like any other statistic and gets lost to history. This being a term that really sits with me after reading Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. What does it mean to be lost to history? Where a full life and the full narrative around any tragedy is reduced to a headline and a single image.
Shaun, we're here with the triptych that is exploring the story of Federico Pereira, a young man from Queens, a part of your life growing, his story in your community growing up. In this graphic depiction that forces us to reflect on our own understanding, emotions of what we know of this story or not, and what we are feeling now, forced through the use of the highly reflective mirror tint back on us as viewers. You're really inviting us through scale, reflection, into this scene. Yet, and interestingly, this content for you was created without any visual reference, unlike other works in the exhibition where we can identify a series of highly circulated images chosen by a photo editor, cropped and altered, that have shaped our kind of collective memory. There's no visual documentation of Federico's story.
That's right.
So how did you bring out this image?
So similarly to how I've been addressing the Attica piece, certainly Shaun Bell and Central Park 5, it was in grappling with the images of contemporary incidents of police murder, Stephon Clark, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Laquan McDonald, that something was evoked in me that I clearly buried. Incidents that maybe either impacted my self-perception, as in the Central Park 5 case, and in Shaun Bell's tragedy, but also in respect to tragedies that I clearly had buried. Freddy Pereira having been my neighbor and killed right outside our building when I was around 13 years old. And in thinking about these stories and the way that they have a cumulative effect in collective trauma, I was compelled to revisit this incident, which was described, I later discovered, as the Rodney King case of Queens. And so to your point, in mid-90s, there wasn't cell phone evidence. And according to one narrative, there were no bystanders. This being in the middle of the night, again outside of our building. And so instead, rather than grappling with the image as it was disseminated by the media, I instead researched the medical examiner's report. And therefore sourced images that could visually describe or correlate to what the medical examiner had stated. Not surprisingly, but always frustratingly and saddening and increasingly maddening and saddening is the way in which what was described in his murder sounded just like what occurred in Eric Garner's case, and certainly the execution of George Floyd. And with the scale of these images, it became important, whether consciously or not, for me to quite literally live in a human-sized drawing. What I've not addressed yet is, while my process is additive, I also use the tool in a really unique way where I'm primarily drawing with my fingertips. And so I apply the charcoal and have a personal touch, a connection to the ways that I am sculpting the image. It becomes a sort of psychic connection to how I internalize and therefore emit what is important in the image. And also maybe subconsciously, because this was not based on a very specific visual document, they started to move toward abstraction, where none of the individuals were identified. And again, because my process is additive, I had not made the decision when initiating the drawing that the victim would not be portrayed. That was a decision in which the process dictated that I see myself in that void. And therefore, as a strategy, as a way of approaching this image, that I implicate you, the viewer, in the ways that you see and do not see. So when grappling with an image of violence, how long do you take? How much time do you spend?
Are you willing to spend?
In placing yourself in the role of aggressor? And if not, where is that space? Where is that time? Where is that intentionality of identifying with the victim? And how is that placed? How is that connected to your own subjectivity, to your own lived experience, to the ways in which we rely on the media? How do we even start to perceive victimhood through empathetic witnessing?
How you move us through this tension of detail and abstraction, and move us from our experience contained in the frame to how this story and our experience with it extends into the gallery. The shadows created from the mirrored tints are haunting and quite literally follow us as we move through the pieces, as much as we see ourselves in the work through the tint. We also see ourselves interacting with Freddie through the shadows, and that the empty space is further activated through his story and your care.
Yeah, thank you for that. If I were to leave you with any one point in regards to my intention in this work, is that I truly believe the way that we see, the way that we perceive a scene, and by extension one another, dictates the way we move through the world. And it is my hope and deep belief that by sitting with these images with a different sense of purpose, with some sense of peace, in quiet, by grappling with the images, that we move through the trauma, that we're informed by what they have to offer, that information then moves us to act differently, giving meaning to this history of violence in the ways that we interact with the world and one another every day.
Thank you for creating this space to invite us to connect with these painful, necessary stories that have shaped us.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here for our video walkthrough. Just a reminder, we are now going to open it up for Q&A, and you can leave your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And before I jump into that, I just wanted to take a moment to thank both of you, Shaun and John, not only for this tour, but more importantly for allowing us at the Bronx Museum to host this exhibition. It's really important, I think, for it to be in New York City, and as a place of conversation, kind of as a homecoming and a conversation that's very specific to not only our city, but also our borough here in the Bronx. And to have these conversations in the context of visibility, and how visibility is not just about being seen for the great things we accomplish, but being seen in sort of a well-rounded and multidimensional way. That's very important. So I think, oh, there's one more thing actually that I wanted to mention, one other person I wanted to thank, who I was remiss in not mentioning before the video started, which is Mahogany L. Browne, who created that incredible poetic response to the Walter Scott work. And for all of you who are in attendance right now, we have commissioned a series of poets to respond to works within the exhibition. And for every program we will be sharing one of those responses, kind of to set the tone for each program. And so for our inaugural program, it was Mahogany, and we are so grateful for that beautiful piece to kick off this conversation. So I am going to start with a question from, I guess I'll just ask the question. This is a question for Shaun. Did your relationship to your body and your own physicality change through the process of making these drawings, particularly given your background in wrestling?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. I mean, I have to answer it somewhat abstractly. I mean, I think what I've mentioned in the tours, that the process of drawing actually gives me, and it's in the actual process of drawing, that I'm given the space to be at peace with these rather charged images. I think it's important to also note that I don't arbitrarily choose images to depict in my work, and that quite often I don't visit the footage until months, if not years later, so that I can think about and grapple with it outside of the media noise. And so, to answer your question, in terms of its relationship to my physicality, I would connote the process of drawing to other contemplative practices that have become important to me in my holistic well-being. That peace, that space allows for centeredness, which has been incredibly important as the world turns upside down almost on a daily basis. The other way that I would connect to this question is in witnessing the footage. I do feel, and this goes back to this sort of embodied knowledge. I wouldn't be able to articulate this necessarily at the time, but in my body, there's a way in which I feel unprepared, uh, sort of hopelessness in the face of police violence to my community. And so what that manifests in is actually revisiting my experience with wrestling, boxing, mixed martial arts, and some like desire to continuously tune up. And so I think it's really not any surprise that in crafting this body of work, I've also returned to the ring as some conscious way to kind of holistically build myself up.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you another question that is kind of similar in terms of bodily perspective. This question says, what a moving experience. Would you please elaborate on your use of wide-ranging scale, both from your bodily and psychic perspective while making the work and from the perspective that you aim to instill in the viewer?
I mean, one way to answer this is quite literally the sort of physicality that it invites when you're in front of the work. And I think that correlates with the different strategies that play out between drawings. So often when it's a single image expanded horizontally to allow a slower reading of the drawings, I produce those in an intimate scale that quite literally pulls you in to examine the details, of the image itself, which I believe requires a close proximity. Whereas there are others that implicate our body and a relationship to the image very differently. And I'm speaking to those that often utilize the mirror tint in which we see ourselves, whether it's the portraits or the later larger scale, more abstract works, as in Federico Pereira. There's a way in which, from a distance, we can literally physically enter the work and see ourselves in that reflection. And so I'm always thinking about, in terms of the strategy that plays out, where it is that I want the viewer to sit and what space is required for an individual to really spend time with the drawing. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And I'll save my questions. It's unfair for me to ask questions when I talk.
Yeah, and let's bring John into this too. I mean, John, you could have probably done a better job at that that answer in some ways. Do you want? I mean, how do you see the bodily relationship to that work? I'd love to hear your voice in that.
One of the I find myself, after looking at this work, talking about through this work with you and audiences for 3 years now at different venues, I find myself still consistently fascinated by hands. The awareness of the physicality of your hands that I think is so present through the medium of drawing. Every stroke, particularly that you're working with charcoal using using your fingers, and that sensitivity and um, that you bring through your own physicality with drawing, but to contrast that with the force and violence of the chokehold that we see or don't see in the police officers' hands throughout the work. I feel that that is a very physical presence for me um, throughout this body of work that amplifies both, again, the presence of the maker and the presence of the, the system, the violent system that ended each of these men's lives. Um, and I also think that the contrast in scale, as you addressed, um, of intimate pieces, that are what, 8.5 by 11 or so. Um, in contrast, we see in the Federico series, especially we're both relatively short. So I mean, I think you could see the scale of how immersive it feels. And I also would encourage people to come to the museum to see really the largest, widest piece, that's Stefan Clark, right? And which we've dedicated a singular wall to. While the piece doesn't fill the entire wall, it is landscape in proportion to the wall that we hope, so it's a rather large piece, but I'd encourage viewers to look for what's abstracted and what details are very finite within it as well. So I think that that sense of uh, the scale of the pieces, like the largest pieces or the most intimate pieces, make us so aware of our bodies in relationship to the bodies we see in the work and how we feel in the space together.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Jasmine.
Sorry. This next question I would love for both of you to answer. How do you imagine young people, particularly teens, might respond to this work? Particularly for Shaun, as you spoke of, drawing on the experiences of your own youth. So either one of you, whoever would like to start.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak there. But just for a moment before I address that question, I know it feels for the invisible audience that they've been interacting with John and I for the last 40 minutes through that pre-recorded walkthrough. However, I feel like we've moved into this Q&A space really almost abruptly. I'm sensing it in my own body, it's in my own psyche. And first off, they're beautiful questions. So I just want to just take a beat to say thank you to folks for joining us in this space and just allowing a bit of a pause because the intensity of which we receive these images, even in a virtual walkthrough, is not often addressed. And so let's just take 5 seconds of silence where we can just breathe together. Thank you. Thank you, y'all. So I've had the honor of sharing this work with young people really from while this is the first, while this last year has been the first instance in which all of this work has been collected together, it's been important to my practice to share this work in different settings, particularly with young people. And we had the advantage of engaging a rather large coalition of young people, specifically at the Mass MoCA show, and we'll be doing so for the Bronx Museum as well. And it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think a lot of what, as I said, what was invoked in me are the ways in which specific incidents return to my memory as they had an impact on my sense of self. What I would argue and what I would suggest is that in my experience, young people are not often offered the space and opportunity to address these tragedies in their own voice via their own lived experience. And again, in my experience, the ways in which they are able to address how they have internalized each one of these incidents. There's a lot for us collectively to gain from hearing those voices. And what I hope is that it is very much this type of work, this type of exhibition that can do so carefully, of course, with facilitation, but with pause and care. That is not the same pace nor the same speed and friction of, say, social media.
I'm so glad you touched on that, Shaun, of the contrast of the pace and virtual, digital spaces with which, all of us and generation has received this information, and the slowness of experiencing the work in the gallery was so important to us in the presentation of this work and for all viewers, but I hope especially for young people. And excuse me.
Thank you both, and thank you for that moment of silence as well, Shaun. I think that was really needed. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. A question for you is for you, Shaun, and I think actually for both of you. Mr. Leonardo, thank you for your presentation of your profound work. How are you working with the censorship issues that occurred in Cleveland, particular the censorship with the idea of empathic witnessing and experiencing the deep grief and trauma through rendering and grappling that your artwork processes? How are you, I'm going to compound this question a little bit, but how are you holding that in your practice and also in process of continuing to make, having made and continuing to make? How personally are you kind of holding space for yourself as someone who's continuously processing this work and these images?
I'm getting a little emotional, and I don't know who has asked this question, but I don't think in the year since the controversy emerged that anyone in the virtual space, outside of my own personal relationships and conversations that I've had with mentors, that has anyone ever asked me how it has landed with me internally. I don't think anyone has ever taken a second to ask me as a practitioner and as a human being how that has been internalized. So thank you, whoever you are. I'm intentionally not looking at the Q&A because it becomes such a distraction. I want to offer a few things. It has reminded me to follow my intuition in terms of relationship with institutions, and to look and really rely on relationships that I believe are fertile ground and that I can trust will invite the messiness. Secondly, I have really revisited and held true the notion that my studio is my sacred and safe space. And knowing that when I'm here, and it's the space that you're currently seeing me in, the only thing that I have here is possibility in speaking to truth. And that will be my mandate, that will be my call for the rest of my life. And finally, you know, in processing really what resulted in the rejection from individuals that I would consider part of my own community, in which, you know, a controversy that was very much crafted in the media, I feel the institution, both the institution of art, but also the institution of whiteness, is let off the hook. And instead, what is placed in the foreground is a conflict between people of color, which is in and of itself the way that white supremacy works. And in understanding and gaining that clarity, really knowing for myself that there's a magic that happens when people engage the work in person. And that possibility, that peace, that learning, that healing is still something that can happen, and it's still something that I believe in. So thank you for that. John, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
I think one of the core frustrations of the controversy, the censorship, was a refusal for dialogue across institutions. There were situations where neither Shaun and I were brought to the table, or conversations were ended to dig into the hard stuff, to put it simply. This is, you know, the biggest lessons learned. I mean, I think the biggest lessons learned out of that is you have to be committed to talk about what makes you uncomfortable and what could make your entire system within you work, and being able to dialogue and talk is core. So thank you for this opportunity to do just that today, and for asking that.
Thank you both, and thank you for that question. We have time. We're a little over time, but we're going to go a little over if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
And there are a couple more questions I'd like to present to you from the audience. One is, I was particularly struck by the drawings of Eric Garner's murder. As much as these videos make explicit the violence Black people face, the fact that so many murders are spread throughout social media sometimes feels like an intentional intimidation tactic of the state. How do you feel your recontextualization of these images fits or doesn't fit within that dynamic?
Yeah, I just blatantly feel it actively works against that dynamic. It's interesting, I've not thought about it as part of the machinery of the state, but I think that is a beautiful thesis and a critical one to think through further. I will say it does, the notion that you're extending does implicate the media very much. By media, I mean news media specifically, implicates news media as complicit to the ways in which these tragedies, these murders are not tended to with the proper weight, and therefore have a role in the ways that we remember or don't remember. And as I said in the virtual walkthrough, I believe that how we remember dictates how we live and perceive one another out in the world. I think there is a direct correlation. So I'll try to name that further for you. I think with the pause, with internalizing these images differently. We are moved not, I don't want to contain it to the action of activism. I think we are forced to examine how we receive information and take it for granted. And therefore, the ways in which we remember and process or don't has a way of dictating how we interact with the world. So, to be more explicit, if we receive, let's say, an image or a piece of video footage of Eric Garner's death, since that is the tragedy that came up, and if we don't sit with that image properly, then how is it that we become complicit in rendering Eric Garner as less than human? If it is only passed through in the same rapidity and the same type of tone and distraction and noise that social media and the news media lends itself to, then what is it that we are doing in just dismissing the tragedy? And so that is the real question for me. Again, returning to this is not the if and when, but the how we look. By deeply internalizing the image, can we move our looking to bearing witness? And to bear witness means to internalize so that we're moved to act differently in the world.
John, would you like to add anything?
I think what I would add is that Shaun and I together and publicly have had conversations of what are the limits of a singular exhibition over a single 2 to 3 month period with which it's on view. The challenge is for myself as a curator, where do I continue this commitment and dialogue? Where does any institution showing this work sustain these commitment to these issues and even return to the issues once the show is over? And of course, ultimately for every viewer, however stirred you are, you may choose to run away or run away towards the emotions that in your memories that were evoked through this work, or you could run toward new opportunities to transform how you act within these systems and your own privilege. So the work begins once you leave the gallery.
One final question, and this one is from me and my students, which is, what does it mean to have this work in a museum context? And obviously every museum is very different. It has a different audience and serves multiple different publics. But I'm just curious from your perspectives as the artist and curator, how you see it functioning in a wider context beyond the show by being in a white box institutional space.
John, why don't you take that first so that I can end off?
Well, I think it might be one of the meta critiques, or questions we're asking. And even through the exhibition design, I feel that there's, the empty space within each work. We casually throw around the phrase sometimes, oh, let the work breathe, breathing space. Takes a painfully poetic, meaning in this exhibition. The negative space between each work, the slowness and the pace. And I'm answering very specifically towards the physicality of the museum, but I think we hope that while you're in it, you are questioning what this question is asking. What does it mean? The privilege of having this time and space to sit with these images, to access the museum and and bear witness is something that not every community has access to, and museums also may not, you know, make bridges with all communities. So I think that there's the levels of accessibility of what, as well as just as Shaun is reframing these mediated stories, in a way, I think we're reframing the white cube through the exhibition itself.
Thank you, John. I don't mind saying that this question points to the reason why it was important for me for the work to land back in New York, and specifically a place like the Bronx Museum. You know, as I told Jasmine, I've been secretly visiting the show without telling any staff members so that I could hide in the background. And what feels unique about the Bronx Museum is that its neighbors actually go there. And I'm able to sit in the background and see how people are sitting with the work, with time. And so I will say this: we've spent a year or more in this racial, economic, cultural reckoning, really re-examining the role of museums. And there is a, you know, I would say a sort of paramount or prevailing question of whether museums can even participate or lead in social change. I want to still believe in museums. Museums, for myself and many other artists of color that I personally know, have always been sanctuaries. And while they've not always been inviting, there have been moments in my life, in my upbringing, and so many of the artists that I know, in which in the work, we feel seen for the first time. And I think what the call is that we're hearing is for museums internally, in both its vision and structure, to match the democratic values that it expresses and purports to be about in the work that it shows. And that for museums to meet the challenges of the questions that the works share. And I want to believe that it is the museum that can serve as a platform for all the messiness of life, in which we can grapple with the most difficult issues of our time, with perspectives that are not our own, with people that we would prefer to identify as other, and to get to the substance of all the shit that makes up our lived experience. And without that, without art and museums in particular allowing for that space, that breath for us to spill out and see each other in all the complexity of life, what other spaces will offer that? I don't know of any other space. And I think art becomes that entry point for nearly everyone, if done well.
Agreed. I like that that sentiment. I think the idea of the democratic space is something that's been phenomenal in theory, and something that we're hopefully all collectively working towards. Thank you both so very much for the tour, for the show, and for answering all of these questions. For all of you who are with us right now, I just want to let you know that this program will be available tomorrow on the Bronx Museum's website. And we also have at least 3 additional programs coming up in the next few months during the duration of the show. And information will also be on the website shortly. Thank you all again for joining us today. Oh, sorry, Shaun, go ahead.
I wanted to extend, and I know that she is a participant in this space, but I wanted to extend the invitation of a community member in the Bronx, Beverly, who has curated. Jasmine, do you remember what the name of the space is? I mean, it's Bronx Art Space, correct?
Yes.
Who has just curated and is opening tomorrow an exhibition specifically on gun violence and the lived experience of Bronx community members with some wonderful artists. Beverly is part of our like I'm now an administrator or something.
It's opening today.
Oh, it's opening today.
Yes.
with the opening reception on Saturday. Thank you, Tasha. And I wanted to call that out and give Beverly a shout out because she's a critical partner in the Arts Council, the Museums Art Council, that will also be participating in our final program, in which we are looking at racism as a public health issue, a public health hazard. And in that program, we will be calling on many Bronx community members that I would consider all experts, whether in the medical industry, academia, or in the field, to offer their perspectives on that issue.
Thank you for reminding me of that. And so we hope all of you can visit the exhibition. As Shaun mentioned, the opening reception is on Saturday at Bronx Art Space, curated by Beverly Emmers. And without further ado, I think we will close it out similarly to how we had a pause with a moment of silence. Thank you all for being here.